The transmission crackled through Commander Jackson Hayes' earpiece at 0600 hours, shattering what had been a peaceful morning on Waypoint Station. Theta, and the words that followed would force him to make a choice that could end his career or save his soul. Commander Hayes, this is Central Command, the cold, bureaucratic voice announced. You are hereby ordered to remand the Velayan juveniles currently under your station's protection to the Science Directorate for Comprehensive Biological Testing, effective immediately. Jackson's hand froze halfway to his coffee mug, his jaw tightening as he processed what he'd just heard, and across the ready room, he saw her Lyra, the young Velayan woman who'd arrived on his station 3 months ago with 7 small cubs. Fleeing persecution on the outer colonies, her luminescent silver hair catching the morning light filtering through the viewport, those distinctive pointed ears that marked her as non-human, tilting slightly as she sensed something wrong in his expression. She wore her usual outfit, fitted tactical pants in deep blue and a sleek, high-necked top with the Velayan symbol embroidered on the shoulder, professional and practical, yet somehow elegant in the way she carried herself, and right now those expressive violet eyes were searching his face with growing concern. Jackson had spent 93 days getting to know Lyra, learning about her people's persecution, watching her care for the 7 cubs, none of them biologically hers, all of them orphaned by raids on Velayan settlements, and somewhere in those late-night conversations over station coffee and shared worry, something had shifted in his chest, something that made this order not just wrong, but unthinkable. Repeat that order, Central, he said carefully, watching Lyra rise from her seat, her instincts clearly screaming danger. The voice came back, clipped and impatient. The Velayan cubs, Commander, all 7 juveniles are to be transferred to Science Directorate Vessel Prometheus for biological research. Their unique neural development requires immediate study. These orders come from Admiral Westbrook himself. Jackson's mind raced because he knew what the Science Directorate really meant. He'd seen the classified reports, the rumors of invasive testing, of specimens that went in healthy and came out broken or didn't come out at all in the name of understanding potential threats to human expansion. Lyra crossed to his desk in 4 swift strides, her movements carrying that peculiar Velayan grace that came from a childhood spent in lower gravity, and she didn't say a word, but her hand found the edge of his desk, knuckles white with tension, waiting. What's happened? She asked quietly, her voice carrying that melodic accent that made even simple questions sound like poetry, though right now there was steel beneath the music. Jackson looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the fierce protectiveness in those alien eyes, the way her whole body had shifted into a defensive posture, ready to fight or flee or do whatever it took to protect her. Charges. And he made his decision in that heartbeat. They want the cubs, he said simply, watching pain flash across her beautiful face like he'd struck her. For testing. The word landed between them like a grenade, and Lyra actually stumbled back a step, one hand flying to her mouth, the bioluminescent patterns that ran along her forearms, markings he'd learned appeared when Velayans felt strong emotion beginning to glow faintly beneath her skin. No, she whispered, then louder, no, Jackson, you've seen them, they're children. Kira just started reading. Tomas still has nightmares about the raid, they've been through enough, they can't. Her voice broke and Jackson was around the desk. Before he'd consciously decided to move, his hands on her shoulders, steady and grounding. Lyra, look at me, he commanded gently, waiting until those violet eyes met his, swimming with unshed tears. I said they want the cubs, I didn't say I was going to give them up. Hope and disbelief warred on her face, and she shook her head. Slowly, you can't refuse Central Command, Jackson, they'll court-martial you, strip your rank, you've worked your whole life to get here. He smiled then, a tight, dangerous smile that reminded her he'd been a frontline officer before politics had shuffled him to this remote station. Then I guess I'll go down doing something that matters. The earpiece crackled again. Commander? Hayes, acknowledge your orders. And Jackson reached up, tapped the unit active, and spoke 4 words that would change everything. Request denied. Central Command. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching for 5 full seconds while whoever was on the other end processed what they'd just heard. And then the voice came back, no longer bored, but sharp with authority. Commander, you do not have the option to deny direct orders from Admiral Westbrook. This is not a request, it is a command. Jackson's eyes never left Lyra's face as he responded, with all due respect to the Admiral, These children are under protective custody on my station, and I have assessed that transferring them would pose an unacceptable risk to their welfare. My denial stands." He could hear sputtering on the other end, threats beginning to form, so he simply reached up and disconnected the cum entirely, and Lyra let out a shocked laugh that was half sob. "You're insane," she breathed, but her hands had come up to grip his forearms, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a tilting universe. "They'll send ships, Marines, they'll take them by force and take you in chains." Jackson nodded slowly, because she was probably right, but then he smiled and said, "Then we'd better get ready, hadn't we?" That's when Lyra did something that surprised him. She rose up on her toes, pressed her forehead to his in the Velayan gesture of deepest gratitude and trust, and whispered, "I never believed I'd find honor among humans again. Thank you for proving me wrong." The moment stretched between them, warm and electric and terrifying in its intensity, before practical necessity pulled them apart. The next 6 hours were controlled chaos as Jackson activated protocols he'd hoped never to use, calling in his senior staff and laying out the situation with brutal honesty. Lieutenant Chen, his tactical officer, whistled low and said, "You're asking us to choose between career and conscience. That's a hell of a position, Commander." But there was no real hesitation in her eyes, and when Jackson asked for a vote, every single person in that room stood with him, even grizzled Chief Engineer Morrison, who'd served 40 years and was 3 months from retirement. "Those are kids," Morrison said simply. "Kids don't get handed over to scientists who see them as lab rats, not while I'm still breathing." Lyra had wanted to stay for the planning, but Jackson had sent her to the residential wing with strict orders to prepare the cubs for potential evacuation, and watching her go had physically hurt. This fierce, beautiful woman who'd somehow become the center of his world in just 3 months. He'd thrown himself into defense preparation instead, because Waypoint Station Theta wasn't a military installation, but it had defensive capabilities, and Chen was already pulling up shield grids and weapons systems that hadn't been active in years, while Morrison started routing auxiliary power to critical systems. The station's other residents, about 40 civilian contractors, scientists, and support staff, were briefed and given the option to evacuate on the scheduled supply shuttle that was due in 30 hours, and Jackson was humbled when only 3 chose to leave, the rest staying to help or simply to bear witness. "This is bigger than those 7 cubs, Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, the station's chief medical officer, told him, her dark eyes serious. "This is about whether we're the kind of species who protects the vulnerable or exploits them. You're drawing a line in the stars, Commander. And it's about damn time someone did." The Prometheus arrived 18 hours later, a massive science directorate vessel, bristling with research equipment, and Jackson noted grimly, a full complement of military escort ships. The hail came immediately, Admiral Westbrook's face filling the main view screen in the command center, his expression carved from granite and old authority. "Commander Hayes, you are in violation of direct orders and in a state of mutiny," the Admiral began without preamble. "Stand down your shields, remand the Velayan specimens, and surrender yourself to custody. You have 1 hour to comply." Jackson stood before the view screen in his dress uniform, every inch the Confederation officer he'd been for 20 years, and he met the Admiral's glare without flinching. "Admiral Westbrook, sir, with respect, I cannot and will not comply," he said clearly. "The individuals you refer to as specimens are children, sentient beings under protective custody, and I have credible evidence that the testing you're ordering would constitute abuse under Confederation law, Article 7, Section 3, Protection of Sentient Juveniles." Westbrook's face darkened. "You don't have the authority to interpret Confederation law, Commander, and you certainly don't have the authority to defy my orders. This is your last warning." Behind Westbrook, Jackson could see them, the science directorate researchers in their sterile white coats, already preparing containment units, neural scanners, equipment that looked more like torture devices than scientific instruments, and his resolve hardened to diamond. "Then I guess we're at an impasse, sir," Jackson replied, and nodded to Chen, who cut the transmission. Lyra had entered the command center during the exchange, the cubs clustered behind her like ducklings, and 7 pairs of wide eyes stared at the view screen where the massive ship hung against the stars. Little Kira, barely 6 years old, with the same silver hair as Lyra and enormous golden eyes, tugged on Jackson's sleeve and asked in a tiny voice, "Are the bad humans going to take us?" Jackson knelt down so he was eye level with the child. aware of every person watching, and said gently, "Not while I'm here, sweetheart, I promise." It was a promise he had no guarantee he could keep, but the smile that broke across Kira's face made him determined to die trying if necessary. Lyra's hand found his shoulder as he stood, squeezing once with more emotion than words could convey, and he covered her hand with his own for just a moment before duty pulled him back to the tactical display. The Prometheus was positioning for what looked like a boarding action, and Jackson's mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios they could hold off Marines for a while. The station's internal security systems were robust, but eventually they'd be overwhelmed, unless Chen. "Get me a direct line to the Confederation News Network," he ordered, suddenly an idea forming. "If they want to do this, we're going to make sure the whole damn galaxy is watching." Lieutenant Chen's face split in a fierce grin as she understood, and within minutes, they'd established a live connection to CNN's main broadcast center on Earth. And suddenly Jackson found himself speaking not to an admiral, but to billions of potential witnesses. "This is Commander Jackson Hayes, of Waypoint Station, Theta," he began, standing in the command center with Lyra and the Cubs visible behind him, a deliberate choice. 18 hours ago I received orders to turn over 7 Velayan children to the Science Directorate for invasive biological testing. I refused those orders, and I'm refusing them now. Not because I'm a mutineer, but because I'm a human being who believes that children, any children, regardless of species, deserve protection, not exploitation. The words flowed from some deep place of conviction, and he saw Lyra's eyes widen as she realized what he was doing, weaponizing transparency, making it impossible for this to happen in the dark. The response was immediate and overwhelming as the broadcast went viral across human space, social media exploding with debate, and within an hour, the Prometheus found itself surrounded not just by the station, but by news drones that had quantum jumped in from 3 systems over, all recording everything. Admiral Westbrook hailed again, and this time his face was mottled with rage. "You're grandstanding, Hayes, using those aliens as props for your career." But Jackson shook his head slowly and replied, "No, sir. I'm making sure that if you take these children, everyone knows exactly what's being done in humanity's name. Do you really want footage of Marines dragging terrified kids onto your ship playing on every screen in Confederation space?" He watched the calculation happen behind Westbrook's eyes, politics and optics warring with authority and pride. And for a moment, Jackson thought he might have won, but then another ship emerged from quantum space, sleek and deadly, a Confederation Navy destroyer, and his heart sank. The new arrival hailed on all frequencies, and the face that appeared made Lyra gasp. It was an older Velayan woman, her silver hair streaked with deep blue, her pointed ears adorned with what looked like official insignia, and her expression carved from rage and hope in equal measure. "This is Ambassador Thera of the Velayan sovereignty," the woman announced, her voice resonating with authority. "The children you are attempting to seize are Velayan citizens under sovereign protection. Any action against them is an act of war. I suggest you reconsider." "Admiral," the situation had just escalated beyond anything Jackson had anticipated, and he felt Lyra move to his side, staring at the screen with something like awe. "That's the ambassador," she whispered. "I got a message to the sovereignty 3 weeks ago, but I never thought they'd actually come. Our people have been so beaten down, so scattered." On screen, Westbrook was clearly receiving frantic communications from multiple sources, and Jackson could imagine the political firestorm now raging through Confederation Command. What had been a simple retrieval of specimens had become an interstellar incident with millions watching in real time. The standoff held for another hour, tension ratcheting higher with each passing minute, and Jackson used the time to let the Cubs talk to Ambassador Thera, their excited chatter and musical Velayan filling the command center as they told her about their new home, about Commander Jackson, who taught them chess, about Lyra, who sang them to sleep every night. The ambassador's stern face softened as she listened, and her eyes found Jackson's across the void of space between their ships. "You are the human who has protected our children?" she asked, switching to perfect standard, and Jackson nodded, suddenly aware of how irregular all of this was. "Yes, Ambassador, it seemed like the right thing to do," he replied simply, and something shifted in the alien woman's expression. Respect, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. "We have been told that humans see other species only as resources or threats," Thera said carefully. "You are risking much to prove that wrong. Why?" It was Lyra who answered, stepping fully into the camera's view. Because he's a good man, Ambassador. Because some humans still have honor. The look that passed between Jackson and Lyra in that moment was caught by every camera, broadcast to every watching screen. And later, people would say that single glance full of trust and something deeper did more to shift human-Velayan relations than a dozen treaties could have. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Westbrook's face reappeared on the main screen, and Jackson could see the defeat in his eyes even before he spoke. Commander Hayes, you are hereby ordered to maintain current status pending a formal inquiry, the Admiral said tightly, each word clearly costing him. The Velayan juveniles will remain on station under your supervision, and you will submit to a review board upon relief. Is that understood? Jackson allowed himself a small smile and replied, perfectly. Sir, knowing that a review board with the whole galaxy watching would be a very different beast than a quiet court-martial.as. The Prometheus and its escorts began to withdraw. A cheer went up in the command center, and Jackson felt the tension drain from his shoulders all at once, leaving him almost dizzy with relief. Lyra was suddenly in front of him, her beautiful face radiant with joy and wet with tears. And she did something she'd never done before. She threw her arms around him in a very human gesture of gratitude. And Jackson found himself holding her, breathing in the subtle scent of ozone and flowers that seemed to cling to Velayan's skin, feeling her heart racing against his chest. You did it, she whispered into his shoulder. You actually did it. They're safe. He pulled back just enough to see her face, those violet eyes swimming with emotion, and said quietly, we did it, Lyra. This was your courage as much as mine. The moment hung between them, charged with possibilities neither had dared voice before, and Jackson became acutely aware of his entire crew pretending very hard not to watch. But then small arms wrapped around both their legs, and Kira's voice piped up. Does this mean we get to stay? Does this mean home? Lyra laughed and scooped the cub up, spinning her once. Yes, little one, we get to stay, and the joy on the child's face made every risk worthwhile. Ambassador Thera requested a private channel, and when it was established, she studied Jackson with those ageless, alien eyes. The Velayan sovereignty does not forget its debts, Commander Hayes, she said formally. You have given us back our children, and shown us that alliance with humanity might still be possible. I will be recommending that our council open formal diplomatic relations, and I will be recommending they do so through you. Jackson blinked in surprise. Ambassador, I'm facing a review board and likely discharge, but Thera smiled, a very human expression on her alien features. I think you'll find that public opinion is a powerful force, Commander, and right now you are the most famous human in 6 systems. The Confederation will not discard a hero. Trust me, she was right. Of course, within days the review board was cancelled, replaced by a commendation ceremony that Jackson attended via HoloLink because he refused to leave the station. And the Confederation Council, bowing to massive public pressure, officially recognized Velayan sovereignty and began asylum protocols for refugees. Waypoint Station Theta became the center of those efforts, transformed from a backwater outpost into a crucial diplomatic hub, and Jackson found his quiet career suddenly anything but quiet. Through it all, Lyra remained at his side, initially as the Velayan liaison, but increasingly as something more, something neither of them had quite named, but everyone could see. They fell into patterns, morning coffee in the observation deck while the cubs did lessons with Dr. Okonkwo, evening walks through the station's garden level that Lyra was transforming with Velayan plants that glowed softly in the dark, late nights in his quarters, talking about everything and nothing until they both fell asleep on his couch, waking with her head on his shoulder and his arm around her waist. It was Chief Morrison who finally called him out, cornering Jackson in the engineering bay with a knowing look and saying, Sir, with respect, when are you going to tell that girl you're in love with her? Everyone on this station can see it, except apparently you two. Jackson had tried to deflect, citing regulations and complications and the fact that they were different species. But Morrison had just snorted and replied, Commander, you faced down the Confederation Navy for her kids. I think we're a bit past worrying about complications. Don't be an idiot. That night, Jackson asked Lyra to meet him in the observation deck after the cubs were asleep, and she arrived in a flowing outfit of Velayan design, deep purple fabric that caught the starlight, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, and those pointed ears tilted forward with curiosity. You're nervous, she observed, moving to stand beside him at the massive viewport. I can see it in how you're standing. What's wrong? Jackson laughed shakily, because of course she could read him that well. By now, 3 months had become 6, and he couldn't remember what the station had felt like before her. I've been thinking about what Morrison said, he began. Then paused because the words were harder than facing down. An admiral had been. Actually, I've been thinking about what I should have said weeks ago. Lyra turned to face him fully, those expressive eyes searching his, and he could see her bioluminescent markings beginning to glow softly under her skin, the way they did when she felt something strongly. Lyra, you came to this station running, scared, protecting 7 children that weren't even yours because it was the right thing to do, Jackson continued. And somehow, in the process of helping you, you helped me remember why I became an officer in the first place. Not for rank or recognition, but to make a difference. To protect people who needed protecting. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and took her hand in his, marveling at how perfectly it fit despite the slight difference in bone structure, the warmth of her skin against his palm. What I'm trying to say, very badly, is that you've become the most important person in my world, he said, meeting her eyes steadily. And if you feel even a fraction of what I'm feeling, I'd like to see where this goes, if you're willing. For a long moment Lyra just stared at him, and Jackson's heart sank, thinking he'd misread everything. But then she smiled, radiant and beautiful and full of emotion, and said, Jackson Hayes, I was willing the moment you said request denied. I just didn't think a human could ever see me as more than an alien charity case. He cupped her face gently, thumb tracing the delicate line of her pointed ear. You're not a charity case. You're brilliant and brave, and you make me want to be better than I am. You're Lyra, and that's everything. When he kissed her, it was gentle and questioning, and she responded by pulling him closer, her arms around his neck, the bioluminescent patterns on her skin flaring bright enough to cast soft light across them both. The kiss was everything, promise and hope, and the bridge between 2 species who'd found common ground in courage and compassion. They broke apart slowly, foreheads touching in that Velayan gesture she'd taught him meant trust, and Lyra laughed softly. The cubs are going to be insufferable about this. Kira's been asking when you were going to marry me for weeks, she said. And Jackson grinned. Well, maybe we should let her plan the wedding. Keep her occupied. They stayed in the observation deck for hours, talking about futures that suddenly seemed bright and possible. About the diplomatic center the station was becoming. About the family they were building from refugees and stubborn humans who'd chosen conscience over orders. When they finally returned to the residential wing, they found all 7 cubs still awake despite the late hour, peeking out of doorways with knowing grins, and Kira announced, finally, Tomas owes me his dessert rations for a week. The mixture of human and Velayan laughter that filled the corridor felt like home in a way Jackson had never experienced. And he realized this makeshift family, this alien woman, whose hand fit perfectly in his, these children who called him Commander Jackson with absolute trust, this was what he'd been fighting for all along. 6 months later, Waypoint Station, Theta hosted the signing of the Human-Velayan Alliance Treaty, with Ambassador Thera and Confederation President Okafor both present. And Jackson stood in his dress uniform beside Lyra, who wore formal Velayan diplomatic robes and had been officially recognized as the Velayan sovereignty's ambassador to human space. During the ceremony, President Okafor pulled Jackson aside and said, You know, Commander, when I first heard about your refusal, I thought you were a reckless idealist who'd caused an interstellar incident. But you've built something here, a real alliance founded on mutual respect. How'd you do it? Jackson glanced over at Lyra, who was patiently explaining some aspect of Velayan culture to a group of human diplomats, while Kira clung to her hand, and he smiled. I just protected some kids, Madam President, he said simply. Turned out that was all it took to change the galaxy. Years later, when people asked Lyra what had made her believe in human-Velayan cooperation, she always told the same story about a human commander who'd received an order, looked at 7 frightened children, and said 2 words that changed everything. Request denied. It became a rallying cry for a generation. A reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to do the wrong thing, no matter the cost. And in the end, that refusal had cost Jackson nothing and gained him everything that mattered: a family, a purpose, and a love that crossed the stars themselves.